Hey everyone and welcome back. Recently Mark and I made a trip down to the Mornington Peninsula to capture some long exposure landscape images, which you may have seen in our previous video. Then we went on to Phillip Island with the intention of photographing birds in flight at the Nobbies, which is one of Australia's most stunning coastal locations and home to the nightly penguin parade. Now I was using the Canon R5 with the RF 100 to 500mm lens, which I've had some good success with in the past, shooting birds in flight on a trail near my home here in Melbourne, and also back in the UK while visiting family in Marlow, where there's a thriving population of red kites. But despite that, I was finding it really difficult to keep up with the speedy and very acrobatic silver gulls and the greater crested terns, which tantalizingly kept their distance from the viewing platform. And Mark, who was switching between his Canon R6, 5D Mark IV and the Fuji X-H2, was also struggling as well. We both regularly photograph air shows purely for fun, but in this instance the subjects were even more nimble and elusive. We had the camera settings at their optimum for this style of photography, which I will go through in a moment, but ultimately it was really more a question of trying to keep the birds in the frame or locking onto them in the first instance. Both Mark and I were using the cameras in TV or shutter priority mode, so let's consider why that was the case first. Now please bear with me if this is something that you're already familiar with, but I think it's worth recapping as to why use shutter priority mode in the first place. So in the shutter priority mode, which is also known as TV, which stands for time value on the Canon cameras, you basically select the shutter speed depending upon the type of photograph you're looking to capture. And with most cameras, you can select speeds that range from 30 seconds up to 1/8000th of a second. And of course, after that, you can also select the bulb mode, which basically leaves the shutter open for as long as you wish, basically for as long as your batteries will last. When you select the shutter speed, the camera automatically selects the appropriate aperture to ensure that you still have a correctly exposed image. Now this is of course based at your currently set ISO value. Now with regards to when I was shooting the birds in flight, I set my camera to auto ISO in order to make sure that any changing light conditions didn't lead to an either under or overexposed image. So when you use a slow shutter speed, such as 1/8 of a second or even longer, you're really doing that to convey a sense of motion within the image. Now, as you can see from this photograph I took a couple of years ago at the Natural History Museum in London, it was shot at 1/4 of a second. Anyone that's stationary and anything that was stationary is of course rendered as pin sharp, and anything that moved has given me that nice sort of a ghostly blur effect, conveying a sense of busyness and motion within the image. Now, if you contrast that with a very high shutter speed, basically then something like a 2000th of a second or 2500th of a second or 3200th of a second is really going to freeze the action. And that's what I was doing when shooting the birds in flight. So I use shutter priority to either convey a sense of motion or to freeze an action for air shows and sports and subjects like that. In the morning while shooting those long exposure landscapes, my shutter speeds ranged from 1.6 seconds all the way to 20 seconds, and for one shot I even went as far as 180 seconds. Now I used neutral density filters to block out excess light, allowing me to extend the exposure time without overexposing the image. This longer exposure creates that soft, dreamlike effect, blurring the movement of water and clouds to convey a real sense of motion in the scene. For landscape photography like this, longer shutter speeds are perfect for adding that serene, almost ethereal quality to an image. In the afternoon though, the challenge completely changed when we moved on to photographing birds in flight at the Nobbies. Instead of long exposures, I needed fast shutter speeds to freeze the motion of the birds. For this, I still shot in the TV or shutter priority mode, whereby I selected the shutter speed and let the camera automatically choose the aperture, with the ISO set to auto to adjust for changing light conditions. To capture the fast and unpredictable movement of the birds, especially the silver gulls, I now set my shutter speed to 1/2500th of a second. A high shutter speed like this is essential for freezing quick, erratic movements. Birds such as these gulls move so rapidly, not just in one direction, but often in sharp and unpredictable angles. Without a fast shutter speed, you would likely get motion blur, and you wouldn't get those crisp, sharp shots where you can see every feather clearly defined. Now, I also used the servo focus mode, which is continuous autofocus, to track the birds while they moved. My subject detection was set to animal eye detection, obviously, which works brilliantly on the Canon R5 as it helps to lock onto the bird's eye, keeping it in focus as it flies, or attempting to. Now, I have heard that the R5 Mark II and the R6 Mark II have an even more accurate autofocus setting, but I'm not sure I can really justify getting either of those just yet. To ensure I didn't miss any key moments, I used the electronic shutter with the high-speed drive mode, allowing me to shoot a rapid burst of frames, perfect for capturing those split-second changes in movement and direction. The electronic shutter also eliminates the danger of vibration caused by the mechanical shutter. And this setup, fast shutter speed, continuous servo autofocus with animal eye detection, and high-speed bursts, was really the key to getting the sharp, detailed shots I was after.
So Mark, we've come down to Phillip Island to take some shots of the birds in flight. How are you finding it and what are you using?
I'm using the Canon R6 with the RF800 lens and struggling at the moment. Just bumped the speed up to about 6400, so that's taken the ISO up to into the thousands. We're trying to get crested terns and Pacific gulls today, and they're moving very quickly on the wings. And yeah, we quickly need some more practice. We clearly need some more practice at catching these birds on the wind.
While I was actually capturing the images, I did doubt at the time as to whether I had successfully got any images in focus at all.
So Michael, what are you using and are you faring any better than I am?
No.
Do you want to think about it?
No. I've got the 1:500, I've got the Canon R5, and I'm shooting at 3200 per second in shutter priority TV mode. My aperture is on auto. I've caught a few interesting birds here and well, the gulls and the terns, but they're moving very, very quickly indeed. I'm using the eye tracking on animal. I'm using servo focus. I'm still finding that they're moving very, very quickly indeed. They're like little swallows. They're very hard to lock onto. But these little fellows are moving so quickly, it's quite a struggle. But I dare say, it's like anything, it is practice. I am using the high-speed drive on this, so I'll have many millions of pixels dedicated to out-of-focus birds and out-of-focus seascapes. But it's part of the fun of it. Whilst I'm here, I've also photographed the geese that you'll see behind me, and they're obviously just stationary, so they weren't exactly a challenge. But I thought I'd just get some nice detail of the feathers as well, which I did again using the 1:500mm lens. This is a superb sharp lens. It's great for shooting wildlife. I just wish these fellows would slow down a little bit because it's difficult.
So it's definitely them. It's not user error at all, is it?
No, it's lack of practice because I don't shoot this sort of thing very often. I think there is an element of spray and pray, but I think most definitely if you ask any bird in flight photographer, and I am not one, I'm just doing this purely for fun, practice makes perfect, as with anything in life. So I need to practice some more.
All right, well, we'll crack on and have a few more minutes of trying to get one in the can.
See what we get.
Okay.
But when I got everything back onto the computer, thankfully I found I had a very good hit rate, and I attribute a lot of that to the RF 100-500, which, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, is a stunning, sharp, and very pleasurable lens to use. For some, these might not be the most exciting or exotic birds to photograph, but for me, it was a great opportunity to practice the skills and techniques needed for capturing birds in flight. Now, as I'm a commercial industrial photographer, I don't get to do this type of photography very often, so it was both fun and valuable chance to hone those skills and push myself outside of my usual workflow. Panning with fast-moving birds is all about predicting their flight path and trying to stay one step ahead. As they dart and change direction, I try to smoothly follow their movement, keeping them in the frame while anticipating where they might go next. One key thing I found is to gently squeeze the shutter rather than jabbing at it. This helps avoid the camera shake and gives you a better chance of nailing that sharp shot. I found that it's also important to stay relaxed and fluid with your movements, letting your body sort of flow with the bird's flight to maintain a steady track. Now, these techniques combined with a high shutter speed and continuous focus can help to make all the difference when photographing high-speed birds in flight. It is important to be mindful, however, that when using long lenses, you quickly become aware of some physical limitations that come into play. The longer the focal length, the more sensitive the setup is to even the slightest movements, which increases the likelihood of camera shake, especially on high-resolution sensors like the one in the Canon R5, where any small shake can result in noticeable blur. Even with good stabilization, you need to be really mindful of your technique to keep everything steady. Another factor to consider is atmospheric conditions. Now, particularly heat haze, when shooting over long distances, the image can become affected by distortion from heat rising off the ground or water, which can soften your shots, even when your focus is spot on. It's one of those unavoidable elements of outdoor photography. Now, because of these limitations, there's a natural temptation to just reach for a longer lens to get closer to your subject. But depending on the conditions, this can actually lead to diminishing returns. A longer reach doesn't always mean a better shot. Sometimes it's about working with what you have and making sure you maximize the clarity and sharpness within those physical and environmental constraints. In other words, I often find myself cropping in post to achieve the image I'm going for. Now, after we finished photographing the birds at the Nobbies, Mark and I headed over to Cape Woolamai Surf Beach to capture some action shots of the surfers in the late afternoon. Even with the light starting to change, I really didn't need to adapt my approach or settings all that much. I was still using the Canon R5, initially with the RF 100 to 500mm lens, but I then decided to switch things up by borrowing Mark's RF 800mm f11 fixed lens, just for that extra reach and to bring those distant surfers closer into the frame, despite what I said earlier about environmental conditions. Meanwhile, Mark was experimenting with his Fuji X-H2 and the Fuji 100 to 400mm lens, as well as his Canon 5D Mark IV, paired with the Sigma 150 to 600, giving us a variety of perspectives and gear combinations to work with. Now, for the surfers, I obviously switched the camera's subject detection mode from animal to people, and my goal was still to freeze the action and motion of the waves and water drop this as much as possible. So although I started working with a shutter speed of 1/800th of a second, I then pushed it up to a 2,000th of a second, knowing that it would of course increase my ISO. Not that I ever regard that as an issue in any case. I really wanted once again to freeze the action and every water droplet, even though the surfers' movements were slower and more predictable compared to the birds we had photographed earlier. As a rough personal rule of thumb, I try to keep my shutter speed at around double my focal length when shooting with the R5. So for example, if I'm shooting at 500mm, I aim for at least 1,000th of a second to avoid blur from camera shake when hand holding. Now this is just my preference. Some photographers can hand hold at slower shutter speeds and I can too. So for example, this image was at 1/8 of a second using the RF 800 f11. But with action shots, I really like to nail the focus and sharpness, especially with fast-moving subjects like surfers or aircraft, which is why I pushed it up to 1/2000th of a second. Now, to keep up with the action, I stuck with the same techniques and settings I used for the birds earlier: high-speed drive mode, electronic shutter, servo focus for continuous tracking, capturing many bursts of shots, ensuring I didn't miss any key moments of the surfers, and also thoroughly clogging up my hard drive. Anyway, back to the final images from the day.
It's a beautiful time of day to come down and capture the surfers doing their thing. Although they're a lot braver than I know the size of the sharks that swim around out there. I went with Mark's RF 800 fixed lens, the f11, so light. Now, thank you for lending this to me, or loaning it to me. I did enjoy using my 1 to 500, but this was just absolutely superb to play with this afternoon. For this type of photography, it's fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah, you can hold it for extended periods of time,
Yeah.
as you say, nice and light. I think you've had more success with it today than I have, which is interesting.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I struggled with the birds with this, so that's understandable. What were you using when we were shooting the surfers?
2 cameras, the Fuji X-H2 with the 100 to 400,
Yep.
and the old trusty Canon R5 with the Sigma 150 to 600.
Okay.
So both telephoto.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see what you got, and actually interesting for me to see how the Fuji handled the action as well, because I know how the R series works with
Yeah.
action shots. So,
Yeah, with the Fuji being relatively new to us, it'll be nice to compare.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, no, that's good. So thank you for the loan of your 800.
Anytime.
As you say, joint custody. Eh?
Shared custody. Shared custody.
Okay, well, well, thank you for joining us today on our trip down to the Mornington Peninsula and Phillip Island. We hope you've enjoyed coming along with us. If you did, please consider subscribing and be sure to give us a thumbs up for it really helps the algorithm for us to make more of these types of videos. So we look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Take care. Thank you.
you.